Man, we're in Joshua chapter 23, I think. Why am I in 24 here? Let me get back to where I want to go. It's going to take me a minute. So I'm waiting on that. Listen, we're at the tail end of everything about this whole journey that we're going to see through this book that we've been looking at in Joshua. So if you remember, Joshua was 30 when he first spied out the land. 30 years old. You remember when you were 30? A long time for some of us, right? But you remember when you were 30? That's the age when he and Caleb and 10 other losers, right, kind of made it to the promised land. Joshua and Caleb come back and go, "Hey man, we can do this thing. We got it, right?" And then because they didn't, they wandered for 40 years. So when we first opened this book, Joshua was 70 years old, right? Having wandered around for 40 years with all of those people complaining and whining. And I'm not saying he wasn't a part of that, but I know that there was this thing called the tent of meeting. And Moses would meet with God there. And Joshua would go with him. And Joshua would go in that tent with him. And then when Moses left, Joshua stayed in there. And Joshua was learning. And Joshua was growing because God had a place for him to be. And that place that he was going to be was going to be the leader of Israel as they wandered into the promised land. Let me get to my Bible. So, he's now, writing at the end of this, 110 years old. It's a whole lifetime, right? So he's standing before them at 110 years old, and he's just going to reminisce. He's called all his old warriors together, all the heads of these nations that he's seen fight these fights for 40 years, who were in the wilderness, and then for the 30 more or 40 more that it took them to conquer the land. And so I really just see this as an old warrior sharing his thoughts on mediocrity and just warning you, don't settle. There's way too much happening for you to settle. And so something powerful about hearing from an old folk. You know what I'm talking about? A few weeks ago, well, actually this week, 15 years ago, my dad passed away. So I was 49 years old when my dad passed. And I miss him every day. I miss what my dad taught me. And I wish he were still here today just to keep. I miss my mama. Because my mama lived with me a lot longer than that. And she was harder on me than my dad was, you know. And I did. And I missed Tammy's dad. Because though I wasn't his son, he treated me like one. And he taught me really so much. And I love hearing from the older people. One of the joys of our life was to be able to settle into this house that we now call our own when it was my mama's. And we decided that we weren't going to build the home that we thought we were. And we were going to stay here with her at the end of life. And still she was speaking into my life during this time. Still. I miss my mama looking at me and saying, "I'm so proud of you." I miss that. I mean, you'd think it, you know, however old I am, I'm not telling. You wouldn't need that, but I like hearing that, right? And so I say all that because I want to put us in this story. Inc. Magazine did something back in 2015, regrets of the aged and the dying. Listen to what these are. Number one, 12 things. I wish I spent more time with the people I love. Right? Wish I'd spent more time with the people I love. Isn't it funny how life can my dad was a salesman right after I got married. his career took him down a path, and he was gone probably 4 nights of a week. My dad missed that time with my little brother, who was 15 when he started doing that. And it was just, my little brother didn't get the same dad that I got. Always haunted my dad to this man. I want to travel. I'd rather be here with my kids. I remember him saying those things. Number 2, wish I'd have worried less, right? You know why? Because worry doesn't fix anything. Jesus told us that, but we're just that stupid, right? When you get to that end, you go, man, I worried about something that never happened. I spent all my life stressed about things that weren't going to do that. I wish I had forgiven more. I wish I had forgiven more. You know, we forgive not simply for the other person. We do so for us. Because unforgiveness is a prison that we put ourselves in. And it takes, till you get old, do you see that more clearly? That that's a silly way of living life. These aren't Christian folk that are writing these. These are just old folk that are dying. I wish I'd have stood up for myself more. Wish I'd have been more honest. It's a raw thought, right? Wish I'd have been more honest. You lose friends when you're dishonest, don't you? I'm not preaching, I'm just reading. I wish I'd have worked less. Wish I'd have worked less. I could say that right now, right? I wish I cared less about what others think. Are these resonating with you? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? As you just listen to the thoughts of people who are near that end of life. Number 9, I wish I lived up to my potential. Right? Wow. That one I feel. I wish I'd have faced my fears. That's number 10. Number 11, wish I'd have stopped chasing the wrong things. I've spent a lot of time doing that, right? And the last one was I wished I'd lived more in the moment. And so, I mean, the age, they have just a longer runway than most of us. And I think to our detriment, we don't pay attention till the elderly. And if there's something that the Lord's blessed me with, it's an opportunity to learn how valuable that is. I love sitting with older people and just listening to their stories. There is nothing greater than that. My life has been shaped and transformed by some of the people that we used to sit around a table with on Thursdays that are no longer here and on with the Lord. But we had these senior days at Restoration Church, and I'd sit around that table and I'd listen to them talk. Man, I miss those days because I learned a bunch from those old folk. Now I am one of those old folk. So these that Joshua are talking to never saw the land of Egypt. They never witnessed the 10 plagues. A lot of them didn't even see the crossing of the Red Sea. And here's what he says. Let's look at it in chapter 23. Now it came about after many days when the Lord had given rest to Israel from all their enemies on every side, and Joshua was old and advanced in years, that Joshua called for all Israel, for their elders, their heads, their judges, and their officers, and said to them, I am old and advanced in years. Can you picture that scene? Just all these guys standing around. I don't know how many that would have been, 12 times, however many that could have been. It could have been 200-300, could have been 2,000 or 3,000. And here's a 110-year-old man standing up before them and says, hey, it's like not he had to tell anybody I'm old and advanced in years. You could see it. He was wearing it, right? I'm old and advanced in years. And you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all of these nations because of you. For the Lord your God, He is He who has been fighting for you. He's standing there now, and they own land, exactly what God said 40 years before. When they were getting ready to cross that Jordan, and the priest hadn't even stepped foot in that water, He said, every foot you trod will be yours, and I will defeat your enemies, and you will settle this land, and you will live in houses that you didn't build, and you will eat of vineyards that you didn't plant, and I will do this for you. And now it's been 40 years, and now Joshua's 110 years old, and some of these people have seen all of that. And he's saying, listen, I want you to understand something. It's God who's been fighting for you the whole time. Don't you think that you did this, right? Don't you think that you did this? And then he gets to verse 4 and 5 and he says this, "See, I have apportioned to you these nations which remain as inheritance for your tribes, with all the nations which I have eliminated. From the Jordan even to the great sea toward the west, and the Lord your God, he will thrust them away from you and drive them from you, and you will take possession of their land, just as the Lord your God promised you." He's going, hey, the Lord's not done yet. There's still other nations that have settled in your land. And he's not done. He is going to drive them out too. God will always fight for you, for the future promises that he's made to you, not just the present one. If that promise is still future, know that God isn't quitting on that promise. And that's what he was there. He's not, listen, they may choose to settle because, hey, we got most of the land. God's saying, I'm not, because I promise you all the land. And I will drive those nations from you. How powerful is that? God won't even let us give up on the promises that he's made for us. It's crazy. Crazy how this works. He's already showed his greatness, right? He showed his faithfulness. He never leaves them not once. He's given them all the possessions that he said he would. He gave them rest in that land. Now they're kind of at rest. They got a few more skirmishes, but they're at rest, and God gave them victory. And now he says, in light of God's faithfulness, let's take a look at your faithfulness. So this is where he's going. So see yourself in this story as we just kind of slowly wander through it. But he gets to verse 6 and he says this, "Be very determined then to keep and do everything that is written in the book of the law of Moses, so that you will not turn aside from it to the right or to the left." What's he saying? I want you to be very firm here. I want you to be very firm in keeping the commandments that God has given to you. You know what that's a statement of? Don't be mediocre. See, you and I get pretty good, and we're all right with being pretty good, aren't we? I'm always pretty good at being pretty good. And if I can hide my flaws and keep you focused on yours, then I'm good. Problem is, that's not how God operates. He wants me to be very firm in my obedience to him and to his ways. And if there's anything that you're hearing from this aged 110-year-old battle-hardened warrior who is still in love with the God today as much as he was when he was hanging out in that tent when Moses had left, this man is now standing and say it's too soon to settle for good enough. Don't you deviate from any of the commandments of God. And so I guess, as I hear that, I'm thinking, what are the commandments that God's called us to? What are those things? I mean, we know too, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, strength. Love your neighbor as yourself, right? Those are it. But how often do we am I doing that? What am I, have I settled and I've got some things that are more important to me than the Lord, but I don't really acknowledge that? And is there some love that the Spirit of Christ, that's kind of welling up within me that's not supposed to be here? It's supposed to be flowing, but I don't have time to go love somebody else because I'm too busy loving me? These are serious questions, and this is what we read here. It's important that we lean not on our own understanding, as King Solomon said. In all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will guide your paths. The minute I tell God, hey, I'm good enough, and I've settled, that's when my less than best days show up. And if we want to get to the end of our life, having lived all of our good days, then we have to focus on what needs to change in my life. And so he's saying, listen, I want you to be faithful in obedience. I want you to be firm in this. You read that word? Be firm. Be very determined then to keep and do everything that is written in the book. A couple of observations. To be determined to do that means we actually have to read the book. I mean, it's kind of obvious, right? But you can't just assume you know what he wants. Man, I'm in the Word, and I'm not talking about myself. I'm just saying because of some things that I made a choice to do to teach every 4 days a morning. I'm in the Word almost every morning. I got to tell you, that has transformed my life in ways that I don't know what's happening to anybody else in that, but my mornings where I spend an hour and a half just kind of drilling down in some text and looking at things, it totally has transformed who I am. I hope so. Thank you. But that's it. I mean, it's just like you see it and you can't unsee it, and you're faced to look at it every day. And so I'm just telling, I'm not saying you got to spend that much time in the Word. I'm just saying, but read it. We got to know His commandments. And you have to do it. You have to open up the book. You have to read the words, right? And then say, am I doing this? What pleases the Lord? Am I doing this? And these are the things that we have to ask ourselves. Now, I could keep drilling down on it, but I think we know what this is. He told Joshua at the very beginning, and I got to believe this is where he is now. In Joshua 1:8, remember when the commander of the Lord of hosts came and stood right in front of him? And he says, don't you depart from my words, not to the right or not to the left, right? And I don't think he ever forgot that. And so I believe that's the lesson from a man who heard the promise of God and 40 years later, 80 years later, 40 years later, still hearing that same thought, right? And so that's the first thing, faithful in obedience. He goes on, he says this, verse 7, so that you will not associate with these nations, these which remain with you, or mention the name of their gods, or make anyone swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them, but you are to cling to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. What's that whole thing about? Listen, not only you have to be faithful in obedience, you got to be faithful to separate from the world that's causing you trouble. See, I don't belong to this world anymore. And these are things we know. Just let me rant for a minute. I don't belong to this world. I live here, but I'm not from here. I gave up my citizenship here, not America, but you know what I mean. I mean my citizenship of the things of this world. My citizenship's in heaven, just like yours is. So these are strangers here, and we have nothing in common with a lot of the folk here. We have a lot in common with all of us who are heading that way. What's he saying here? Be careful who your friends are. How can two walk together unless they be agreed, right? Too many of us have friends that are really good friends, but they don't even know Jesus. And so I'm not saying don't be with them, but I'm saying he's saying, listen, here's what's going to happen. You'll get. Show me your friends, I'll show you your future. I know I'm talking to adults instead of kids, and you think, well, I'm not going to give up on my friend. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm telling you what happens, because this is what he says here. They will wear you down, which is exactly what happened. We know the history of this nation. This isn't the end of that. We know that they end up having judges, and then they have kings, and then they do exactly what he says they're going to do. They didn't drive those people out, and they begin to intermarry, and they begin to worship those gods. And that's what sent them into exile, right? And so you and me, listen, that's why you can choose to jump into the things of this world, the political sides and all that. And it's tempting not to do that. But listen, if you're taking your cues from some talking head on TV that you don't even know if they have a knowledge of who God is, that's the wrong move to make. We have to separate ourselves out from all of those things and focus on those things that matter to God. I've got to be careful to do that. That's why in Romans, and I share this a lot with us, I think, but Romans, it says, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Real carefully, that word, be not conformed to this world, is not an active participle. I'm giving you more grammar than you're going to want to know. It's a passive participle in the Greek. The reason why that matters is he's not saying, hey, don't choose to conform to the world. He's saying, don't allow the world to do that to you. They do that to us because we've got too much of a foot in the world and in those friendships, and we do like they do. So they whine and complain, and guess what we do? We whine and complain, right? They chase after this, and guess what we do? We chase after that. They find peace and comfort in this pill or this bottle, and guess what? We do that, right? And so I just want us to be clear on what we're doing. He's saying, hey, listen, we ain't got time for that. Separate away from those things. I wrote down some for myself. I'm just going to share it with you. Signs of conformity. How do I know that I'm allowing the world to squeeze me into its mold? When I start worrying more about me than I do you, that's the world does that. That's self-centeredness. And the world is telling all of us now, We got to have me timing. We got to have self-care. We got to have, and I get that in a measure. But in a sense, I can't see Jesus and his guys going, now listen, we need some self-care here, and you need boundary. And again, I realize some of you I'm messing with your head, and I don't mean to mess with your head other than to say that I can't be absorbed with myself. When I become obsessed with myself, what happens? I get envious of others. I get jealous of others. I get angry with others, right? All of those things begin to take place. It's when my eyes are off of me and onto you that I live my best life. And so I believe that's one of the ways that the world does it. It forces us to go, yeah, they're right. They don't have a right to do that to me, right? And those are the kind of things that happen. The other one is we tolerate sin and evil, right? We do. We go, And now I sound like my dad, but I remember, man, we'd be watching some TV show when I was a kid. My dad, if I hear one more word like that, I'm turning it off. He'd yell it from wherever he was in the other room, And then it got to where those words were like nothing. And now there's other words. It's like, man, certain words you hear. But then you got other people, they sit around and they hear it, and it doesn't even bother them. And I'm not trying to sound like an old man. I'm just telling you, we do that in so many areas, don't we? We just assume that it's okay to gossip about people because everybody does it. And he's saying, don't do this. This is not who you are. You're being conformed to the world when you do that. The third thing is when there's a lack of joy in your life. You know what I've noticed? You start hanging around the world, there's not a lot of joy there. And they're just not happy people. I was telling Trevor the other day, I'm going to put a sign up. I'm a fire whiny people, right? I mean, it's just like, there's no room for that. I mean, let's just stop it. We got a job. We're happy. You should be happy. You're taking a paycheck home, right? And you work with me. I'm a great guy, right? And I'll get to work with you. Why are you whining about this, right? And so look, these are for me. If they hit you somewhere, that's on you. And the fourth one is just this opinion-based living, where it's just, well, my opinion matters more than anything else. If there's been a weakness in my life, it's that. I've always felt like I'm right. My opinion's right. I don't have to rethink it. It's just the way it is. Just take it or leave it, but I'm right? You can have your opinion. I just don't want to know about it, right? And that's a terrible way to live life. Now, we're going to be done with this. I got just a few more here. So let's look at verse 8. So two things we've seen so far. He's saying, hey, as an old man, he's going, hey, you be faithful, to be firmly obedient to God. Don't you deviate from that. And don't you let the world squeeze you into its mold. You be faithful to separate from that. That's not who you are. The third one is to be faithful, our faithfulness and affection. Look what he says in verse 8. But you are to cling to the Lord your God. I love that, right? Cling to the Lord your God, as you have done to this day. For the Lord has driven out great and mighty nations from before you. And as for you, no one has stood against you to this day. One of your men puts to flight 1,000. For the Lord your God is he who fights for you, just as he promised you. Have you not looked around and seen that you're stronger than everybody else around? The enemy's coming at you and they don't have what you have because they don't worship me and I'm not in them and my spirit's not in them and my word's not in them, but they are in you. You can put 1,000 to flight and they can't figure that mess out. And he says, this is what's going on. Verse 12, for if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, he just gave us what he's saying. You cling to me, not to the world. Cling to me, not to the world. Cling to me, not to your friends. Cling to me, not to the news. Cling to me, not to anything else. This is what he's saying. For if you ever go back and cling to the rest of these nations, these which remain with you, and intermarry with them so that you associate with them, and they with you, know with certainty that the Lord your God will not continue to drive these nations out from before you. But they will be a snare and a trap to you, and a whip on your sides, and a thorn in your eyes, until you perish from the good land which the Lord your God has given. That's a strong rebuke, isn't it? We should receive that. We should understand he's saying, hey, I want you to be faithful to me. If you go out and you play the harlot and you chase the world, there's going to come a time I'm going to let you do that. I'm going to let you know what it feels like to do that. Doesn't it? You're going to want to crawl back to me. But this is who he is. Listen, he's a loving God. And He's a just God. And He's a wrathful God. And there's a wrath being stored up, soon to be released, I believe, on this whole world. We don't want to be on that side when that happens, right? And so this is what he's saying. Now let's keep reading. Verse 14. Now behold, let me get, did I finish this? Now know with certainty, until you perish. Okay, we're good there. Take great care to love the Lord your God. That's what he's saying, right? What did he tell the church at Ephesus? Remember, if the church starts out in Ephesus and it was like, man, your deeds of love and everything are well known. I mean, I'm just grateful for that, right? And he speaks that way. And then you a few years later, you hear John write a letter to the church at Ephesus. And he goes, what happened to that? You're still going through motion. But you know what you did in the midst of doing that motion? So you still kind of have the outward aspect of it. But you know what's missing? You don't love me like you used to. Why you do that? I'm afraid that's the church. We're so busy playing church, we forgot that it's about Him. It's about Him transforming us. It's about Him working in us. We just think we get credit for going to the country club of our choice. Call it whatever church you want to. And I'm not slamming everything. I'm just slamming everything, right? I mean, we have to say, why am I good because it's a habit now? Or am I good because the Lord compels me to do that? I want to be compelled by the Lord. I want to be so in love with Him that I see things just like He did, right? That's what John said, the aged apostle, right? If anyone claims to be in Jesus, then he must live like Jesus. And so this is what happens because it rubs off on us. There's a great passage of Scripture that says, and Jesus was with His disciples, and they went out and rested. And it says, and he was, the Bible doesn't say he was spending time with them. The Greek statement there was he was rubbing off on them, right? You know what happens when you spend time with people? You rub off onto each other, right? Some of your bad habits and some of your good habits and then some of theirs. And that's why, hey, we need to be hanging out with Jesus a whole lot more. Because faithfulness and affection. Then he gets to verse 14, and now this is, you feel like this should end the book, but it won't. He's going to say this thing one more time, and we're going to see it next week. Listen to what he says. Now behold, today I am going the way of all the earth. Josh is like, I'm done, man. This is my last hurrah. 110 years I walked this place. I'm just ready. I want to see Jesus. And you know in all your hearts and in all your souls that not one word of all the good words which the Lord your God spoke concerning you has failed. They have all been fulfilled for you, and not one of them has failed. That's why we sang the songs we sang this morning. That's why goodness of God came to my mind. That's why more than able, when did we forget that He was that faithful and that He could do those things even when we can't see it? That's where that song, man, I just love you, Lord, because you, as I look at my life, you have been faithful. In spite of me. If you knew half the stuff that I did, you wouldn't even be in this room with me. I promise you that. And I'm so grateful that God in His grace and His mercy has covered some of my sin and then forgiven all of them. So this is how it goes. And he says this. But it will come about that just as all the good words which the Lord your God spoke to you have come upon you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the warnings until He has eliminated you from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. When you violate the covenant of the Lord your God which He commanded you, and you go and serve other gods and bow down to them, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you will perish quickly from the good land which He has given to you. Isn't that amazing? Listen, we're in a different season than they are. But the reason why Paul says that some of you are sick and some of you sleep in a communion issue is because the Lord will discipline those. He's saying the reason why you're that way is because you're in sin. And so some of you are sick and some of you sleep because you're in sin. Listen, God will remove His hand from us sometimes. And He will allow people to get sick and other things. And nobody likes to talk about it. But Paul did. And he said, you need to get right. Because that's the Lord chastening and reproving you. That's why when you get to James and he says, are any of you sick? Let him call for the elders. That's why he says, confess your sins one to another, that you may be healed. The whole thing is connected. The reason why many of them were sick was because they were living in sin. And the minute they confessed it, it says they will be restored. This is the context of that. And so I'm not trying to overwhelm us with this. I just want to understand something. You and me should cling to the God of all creation because he is our only hope. And the minute we let go of that, every good thing that we have, we're going to watch it kind of slip away. Not because God's not faithful, but because God's going to let you have with that place that you want. And that doesn't have anything to do with your salvation. It just has to do with, because that's his. You're right there, right? So nobody can take him from you. You can't give yourself back. He owns you. He's already got your name in the book. He's already got a nickname waiting for you when you get there. And you belong to him. Because his seed is now in you, because the Holy Spirit is in you. And the Holy Spirit never leaves you nor forsakes you. So if you're a believer in Christ, genuine believer in Christ, you don't have to worry about your salvation. But you ought to worry about your sanctification. That process where you begin to look like him. Hope that didn't sound like too much heavy preaching today, but man, that's good stuff. Let's sing our way out of here today. We hadn't sung this one in a while. I like this one.